You were very concerned.
Of course I was very concerned.
And why didn't you take him to the doctor?
He said he didn't need to go and he didn't want to go.
Was that his choice or was that your choice?
Well, I think it was a combination of a lot of things.
What happened?
I went in to lay down, and when I got up and I went back in there, he had stopped breathing.
The First Amendment of the United States Constitution prevents the government from making laws that would prohibit the free exercise of religion. In Clackamas County, Oregon, a small Christian denomination known as the Followers of Christ had tested the right to practice their religion for decades, and that included the controversial ritual known as faith healing. For years, the members of the church would allow their children to die from very treatable illnesses because they believed that seeking out medical assistance indicated a weakness in their faith. But in 2008, after a 15-month-old girl died from pneumonia-related sepsis, the local authorities had had enough, and they prosecuted her parents unsuccessfully. 3 months after she died, her 16-year-old uncle, Neil Beagley, also died. And this time the illness was a long battle with a very treatable urinary condition. But his death gave the Clackamas County District Attorney's Office another chance to send the followers of Christ a clear message. That message? The health and safety of their children outweighs their right to adhere to faith healing.
Clackamas County has basically every type of person you can want, and most of them are pretty friendly.
And it's a very beautiful place with beautiful people, but a lot of tolerance for the fringes. They were in the forefront of assisting and supporting religious freedom and beliefs.
We begin with the investigation into the death of an Oregon City teen who was a member of the Followers of Christ Church.
And tonight, a local doctor who helped draft the Oregon law dealing with faith healing explains why charges should be filed in this case. 16-year-old Neil Beagley died Tuesday at his home in Gladstone. Authorities say his urethra became blocked, preventing him from urinating. They also say it was an easily treatable condition. Beagley's church rejects modern medical care in favor of prayer or faith healing.
So the Followers of Christ Church in Oregon and elsewhere believe in faith healing, so the laying of hands, praying and things like that to cure, any kind of disease or ailment. They do not believe in medical intervention, and it's something that has gotten them in trouble over the years.
Anybody have anything to say on behalf of the church?
The media attention that this case drew was significant. People were shocked that a child had died from a medical condition that was treatable. And I think it raised interesting philosophical or maybe legal questions about religious freedoms versus societal responsibility for the care of children. On June 17th of 2008, at his grandmother's home in Gladstone, Neil Beagley, 16-year-old boy, lay in his grandmother's bed, dying. He was surrounded by friends and family, but doing what they do when people are seriously ill, and that was to pray, to lay on hands, to anoint with oil. And he lay there to die from a treatable condition. Neil's father, the defendant, Jeffrey Beagley, as well as his mother, who was in the room, did absolutely nothing. They did not attempt CPR. They didn't call 911.
When you can't take care of your kids because your religion says you can't call a doctor, go to a doctor. I've never seen that in the Bible, first of all, so I don't know where you're getting it from. Somebody decided that, and everybody's following it. And yet, everybody seems to be nice people, except for that.
In the spring of 2008, the State of Oregon Department of Human Services assigned a trained child protective service agent. That's Jeff Lewis. And he met with the family not just for a few brief moments. He met with them twice. Mr. Lewis told Marcy and Jeff that Neil has a say in the matter. Neil's answer was no. And he told Mr. Lewis, I'd already told my parents that. Mr. Lewis told Marcy and Jeff Beagley that there is an ORS statute which gives Neil the ability to decide whether or not he goes to the doctor. Neil was capable of making his own decisions. And Marcy and Jeff did nothing wrong.
What happened at that point in time?
There's a deceased 16-year-old male there, Neil Beagley.
And was there any evidence that anyone had called 911?
Nobody did call 911.
On June 17, 2008, 16-year-old Neil Beagley died after a long illness. He was surrounded by many members of the Followers of Christ Church. Family and friends felt they did all they could for Neil, including praying, anointing him with oil, and laying hands on him. What none of them did, including his parents, the defendants, was to seek medical help or call 911. For the Beagleys, Neil's death was God's plan. For the Clackamas County prosecutors, it was a crime, criminally negligent homicide.
I pull up and there's a lot of other detectives who are arriving. There's a lot of cars parked there already. There's people inside this house. There's people outside of the house.
They were at Grandma Beagley's house, so this was, the elder member of the family. Dozens and dozens of people, all church members, that were present at the scene.
I was born into the Followers of Christ Church in Oregon City, and that is the only way you can join. I left at the age of 21 and was shunned when I left by my family and everyone I knew.
It's as close to being a cult without being a cult. The Followers of Christ Church were founded at least 50 years ago by a fellow by the name Walter White. They believed that Walter White was a kind of prophet, somebody who had a pipeline, was able to interpret the words in the Bible, and frankly, they didn't read the Bible.
Go ahead and describe then what happened at that point in time.
There's a deceased 16-year-old male there, Neil Beagley.
And was there any evidence that anyone had called 911?
Nobody did call 911.
We looked at Neil and he looked sick. He had blisters on his hands. He was thin. And you can see the despair with the parents, with Marcy and Jeff. They were very sad about this. And that makes it even harder because nobody's winning. Like there's no, in a lot of our cases, there's a bad guy or a bad girl. And in this case, there's not really. Everybody's losing.
Detective band with the Oregon City Police Department asked people to remove themselves from the scene so I could preserve the scene with photography. Yeah, that is the master bedroom. Neil is laying off to the left in the bed.
Our job is to find out what happened, to get to the truth, not presume, not jump to conclusions, but rather to be thorough, ask all the questions, collect all the evidence, and the truth will present itself.
We introduced ourselves, an officer offered our condolences, explained who we were, and that we'd like the opportunity to talk with Mrs. Beagley.
I told him he always had the option to, if he chose so, to go to a doctor or a hospital, and that we would stand by him regardless. And he said he wanted to put his trust in God, and that is what he believed.
Being on the jury during the trial was tough, and it was tough to sleep because, I saw myself in that kid. He was 16, he had a 68 Camaro, he had stripped it down, he was rebuilding it, he loved basketball. That was my favorite sport, was basketball. He was a Blazer fan, and I saw a lot of myself in him. Jeff and Marcy Beagley were very fond of their son. Jeff Beagley in particular talked about shared experiences and doing things together. Marcy was a little bit more distraught, a little more remorseful, and it appeared as if she wished that she had maybe done more for her son.
Was he eating okay during this period of time?
He's never been a great eater, and he ate, no, not very well.
The physical evidence at the scene that was useful included the journal.
That's a photograph of a portion of the feeding schedule for June 14th. It says 11 a.m., a little bit of broth, potato, and strawberry, which is abbreviated. Right underneath that, it says threw up. 1 p.m., broth, potatoes, and watermelon. 2:30, part of granola bar. 6 p.m., 1/2 glucerna, little bit of watermelon, and 3-4 blueberries.
The defense took the position that they have religious freedom in this country. These were their beliefs, that they believed strongly in faith healing, that they didn't do anything wrong. Their clients cried all the way through the trial. They lost their son. I mean, in a lot of ways you can say, isn't that enough punishment? But they also argued those symptoms were not of the type that you would expect someone to die. And Neil himself believed in faith healing. He himself felt that this was what would cure him.
He said that Neil's legs were weak and that his back hurt. He also said that Neil had told him that he couldn't breathe well when he ate too much.
He developed a physical problem that he actually Googled and thought was like a peptic ulcer.
And is there a general topic or theme throughout each of these documents that you've reviewed?
Yeah, they all, in bulk, seem to be concerning ulcers, how you can heal an ulcer, diets and foods that are good for someone with an ulcer or heartburn, bad foods for someone with a peptic ulcer.
I think there may be in many faith healing situations a real tension that exists within these parents about what is the right thing to do. They want to save their children, but at the same time, they feel they're being tested in their faith.
Did Neil ever want to see a doctor for anything in his life?
He always said no.
He said they hardly got done praying for Neil and he stopped breathing. He asked him, did you do any CPR at that point? And Mr. Beagley said no. Detective McKean asked Mr. Beagley if he had called 911, and he said no.
Having to do it all over again, did you change anything that you did to help Neil in any way?
As hard as this is, having to do it over again, I would still honor my son's wishes.
Well, what was it that he said?
Just said that he was proud of his son, basically because he'd held his faith to the end.
Now, what was your general assessment of Neil's health at that time?
That he was sick with the common cold.
Clackamas County prosecutors wanted to show the jury that 16-year-old Neil Beagley's death was part of an ongoing pattern of behavior by members of the Followers of Christ Church. But in order to prove this, they'd have to convince the judge that the death of his 15-month-old niece, Ava Worthington, just 3 months earlier, was something the jury needed to hear. After all, baby Ava died under very similar circumstances.
On March 2nd, 2008, Ava Worthington died a needless death.
The Ava Worthington case was in March 2008. The Beagley case was about 3 months later, June 17th of 2008. We were still investigating the first case and hadn't completed that investigation when this call came out.
I was a lead investigator in a case that occurred at Crestview Drive in Oregon City, Clackamas County. It involved the investigation of the death of a 15-month-old girl. It was an unattended death. She died without medical care. During the investigation, I learned that Jeff and Marcy Beagley had been at the house where Ava Worthington passed away.
We had the ammunition that we did not have in the first case. Neil's parents were at the death of their granddaughter. I mean, that was powerful stuff.
Did they also, as grandparents, participate in faith healing of Ava during that 24-hour period?
Yes, they did. They reported that in an interview.
They knew better. They knew when the first child died. They knew when the second child died. They knew that their grandchild and their son were seriously ill, and they didn't get medical care because of their religious faith.
The caller said the family belongs to the followers of Christ Church and don't believe in modern medicine as an acceptable moral choice for health problems.
That came from the anonymous caller.
Correct.
We were aware of Neil because at the time that Ava died, there were concerns around the Beagley's family. Children's Services had been involved with that case.
What was reported regarding Neil's health and physical condition?
It was reported that Neil is currently ill and his throat, or that illness is causing his throat to close, making it extremely difficult to breathe.
So a DHS investigator had previously been to the Beagley residence, had spoken to the parents, had spoken to Neil, and had responded to some concerns that were reported to them about Neil's health.
There was an agreed upon time when you were going to be there,
Well, I called ahead and said that I was on my way.
okay? And so they knew that you were going to be there, so he wasn't laying in bed
Right.
or anything like that. He was dressed, right?
Right.
A worker responded to the call, knocked on the door, was told to come back, which he did, and Neil was present. I'm getting all this from the witness, who was a key witness in the trial, and of course, it was a problem for us. Because when he came in, Neil presented in a way that did not appear to the worker that he was seriously ill, which in fact he was seriously ill.
What was your general assessment of Neil's health at that time?
That he was sick with the common cold.
And what was your assessment of the parents and how they were taking care of him?
I felt that they were doing a job as anybody could expect of a parent with a kid that's reporting, a cold.
Jeff and Marcy Beagley presented well. They owned their own business. They appeared to be hardworking, God-fearing people.
How long did that interview take place?
Less than 10 minutes.
And in the time that you spent with him, did he seem healthy to you?
Yes.
So he was reporting that previous in his life, throughout his life, he had previously had the flu and colds. And then he told you the same thing, didn't he? He told you that his parents would anoint him when he was sick or has the flu. That's all he said about what they would do, wasn't it?
That's correct.
Now, did they also say that they do go to the dentist?
Yes.
And they also go to an eye doctor? Is
Yes.
that right? And then in their words, they said, didn't they? But they did not believe in life-saving medical professionals.
Those are probably my words, but they don't believe in doctors that treat illness or doctors other than dentists and eye doctors.
Well, you put in there life-saving. Was that in there for a reason? You said before that those were their words. Life-saving medical professionals.
I don't know if those are their words, but they're to categorize the type of doctor.
Was it very clear to you that what they told you was that even if it was a life-endangering situation, that they weren't going to medical professionals? Did they communicate that to you?
Yes.
Is that absolutely clear as you sit here in front of this jury?
Yes.
Do you believe that medical intervention would have saved his life?
Yes.
And how would you expect his quality of life to be in the long term?
The long term would be good.
"16-year-old Neil Beagley died as a result of a congenital urinary tract blockage. So it's no surprise that both the prosecution and the defense would call a roster of medical experts to sway the jury, much like the trial against Carl and Raylene Worthington for the death of their baby, Ava.
Can you explain why it was that Neil Beagley's case would have been a case that would have required an autopsy?
As far as we knew, this was a 16-year-old with no known medical conditions or traumatic events that should have been expected to cause him to die.
By the next morning, the autopsy had been completed, and then we knew that Neil Beagley had passed due to complications from a bladder obstruction.
which had ultimately caused his kidneys to malfunction and fail him.
The first thing that I saw was an incredible amount of fluid. So his abdominal cavity was full of fluid, a large amount of fluid surrounding both lungs, fluid surrounding the heart, fluid basically oozing out of the tissues. Ultimately, everything as far as the problems that Neil was undergoing were a result of a blockage at the outlet of his bladder. Urine basically couldn't get past this blockage.
Luke was a doctor. He was one of the 4 Gospels. So I don't know where they come up with you can't see a doctor.
What did you conclude as the cause of death for Neil Beagley?
I listed his cause of death as complications of bladder outlet obstruction.
I just thought doctors were bad people. I remember being in probably 5th or 6th grade, and we had career day, and kids could bring their parents to talk, and a doctor was in there. And I thought if I stayed in the room, I was gonna go to hell. And I got up and ran to the bathroom and stayed in the bathroom until the doctor was gone.
You've never seen a case like this before as a medical examiner?
No.
The Christian Science Church is very different from followers of Christ Church, and they should not be confused. Mary Baker Eddy, who came up with the various doctrines of Christian Science, she believed that illness and sickness were not true, were not real. That's very different from faith healing, where followers of Christ and others who believe in faith healing actually believe you are sick. But the point is the way to remedy that is through prayer and anointing with oil.
The appearance of the urinary tract on the gross specimens, which means the specimens taken from his body, which constitute the entire urinary tract, are absolutely consistent with a posterior urethral valve situation where there was progressive destruction of the urinary tract. It's classic for that abnormality that is a congenital abnormality that he was born with.
Okay, and on the spectrum of most severe to least severe in terms of this valve, where would you estimate Neil's would end up?
1 to 10, 10 being the worst. I've never seen a more complete destruction of the urinary tract from posterior urethral valves than I did in the case of Neil Beagley.
Marcy and Jeff had known for some time that Neil was sick and revealed that over the previous roughly 3 months, he had no appetite or he would throw up.
What's the highest level you've ever seen in your almost over 20 years of experience?
Well, in patients in complete and total renal failure, I've seen them in the hundreds. Those patients are very sick. It's remarkable to me that at a level of 288 that he lived as long as he did. Actually, that toxin level, as history proves, is not compatible with life. And it's an astronomical level. I mean, you'd want to see your BUN be in the range of 8 to 23, and we're talking about 288, which is mind-boggling.
He would complain that his back hurt at some times. Neil would complain that his chest felt tight at times. But they would refer to all these as episodes, and then he'd get better, they'd say. And then he could walk on his own, they'd say. But then he may be bedridden.
Do you believe that medical intervention in the last week of his life would have been successful?
Yes.
Just if he'd gone to the doctor one time, they'd have found him. This never would have happened. For 16 years, they could have done it one time.
If you were given the opportunity in the last 48 hours of Neil's life, do you think that you and the other medical professionals would have been successful in keeping him alive?
Yes.
If on the morning of the 17th you were contacted or Neil was brought to a hospital, do you believe, and that was the day that he passed away, do you believe that medical intervention would have saved his life?
Yes.
And how would you expect his quality of life to be in the long term?
The long term would be good. If we had him before he went into that arrhythmia, which probably he went into, right before he died. I mean, probably minutes before he died. If we had gotten to them at that point, that he could be standing here today, no question in my mind, none whatsoever.
You were very concerned.
Of course I was very concerned.
And why didn't you take him to the doctor?
By all accounts, Neil Beagley was a bright boy, mature beyond his years. The defense tried to make that argument that even at 16, Neil had a strong faith and was allowed to make his own decisions regarding his health. Prosecutors tried to poke holes in that defense by pointing out that in the followers of Christ Church, there's a lot of pressure to conform, pressure that would severely limit Neil's options.
The directions talk about or instruct the student to write about a person you know well.
Yeah.
It can be someone you like or someone you do not like. What character traits make this person special? Is that what the instructions were?
Sorry.
Take our time. Who did Neil write about?
Me.
The emotions was tough because I saw that and I knew the parents were good parents in every other way. They had good, fun times.
We both enjoy riding on the sand dunes and camping, and I would like to be able to spend more time with him. It's fun times with my dad.
Did your boy Neil ever complain to you about problems peeing or with his private parts?
Never.
Did he ever complain of pain 10 years ago, back in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003?
Absolutely never.
Do you recall having a specific conversation with Marcy about Neil's health?
Yeah, we were at my sister's house in the summer at a family function. Marcy asked us if we had ever heard of a child not being able to go to the bathroom, and then somebody asked, you know, was it constipation or what? And Marcy clarified and said it was no problem going to the bathroom. Somebody asked if it was painful, and she said that it was.
Part of our job is that we look at children as one of the most vulnerable populations in our society. Who's going to take care of them? And not only do they not have the parents taking care of them, but even the groups around them. So a lot of them are homeschooled, and you have people around that it's the same people seeing these kids and are supportive of what's going on.
And Ava died on March 2 of 2008?
Yeah.
And you were there when she died?
Yeah.
And where was that?
It was at her house.
How did that affect you, just emotionally?
I grew up with kids dying. I grew up with like a kid not very much older than me stepped on a rusty nail and died from tetanus. I grew up with this happening and it didn't seem strange at all.
Was the action that was taken in terms of providing faith healing efforts, is that consistent with your own personal beliefs?
Yes.
And so there was nothing that was done there that was inconsistent with what you think should have happened?
No.
They had the grandmother on one of the first witnesses, and the prosecutor was asking her questions, and she was kind of evading the answer, and I'm thinking, they got something they want her to say.
Did everyone in your home believe in faith healing?
Yes.
As far as you know?
Yes.
And did everyone in your home, as part of the belief of faith healing, part of it was not to avail themselves of medical treatment?
Yes.
And including yourself?
Yes.
Have you ever been to a doctor?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
I was at a doctor once.
So you went to a doctor?
Well, I didn't really, well, I had a test to see if I was diabetic.
So you were willing to get a treatment or to get tested to find out whether you were diabetic?
Yes, I did. That's what I did.
Okay. Is that the only time you've ever gone to a doctor?
Yes.
Have you ever had a back problem?
Yes.
Did you go to a doctor?
No.
Have you ever had any surgeries or removal of anything?
No.
Moles or anything like that?
Oh, well, moles, yes.
And it finally came out that you did go see a doctor, and it was for cosmetic reasons.
And was there a point that you thought that in March that Neil might not make it?
I was worried about him. Thoughts cross your mind all the time. It doesn't mean that's what you believe.
Right. So that thought crossed your mind?
Possibly.
Most people who actually practice faith healing are constantly on alert, particularly if a child has some type of condition already that they are aware of. And so my sense is they are more consciously aware of the risk of death because of their belief systems than a lot of other parents would be.
Do you remember whether or not there was faith healing involved in Neil's condition prior to his death?
Yes.
And did you participate in that?
Yes.
And by participating, what did you actually do? What did you do?
What did I do?
Yeah.
Prayed.
Prayed. Were you involved in the laying on of hands?
Well, yes, that's what you do when you lay hands on, you pray.
Tell us about that day, how he was doing, kind of from the morning to the time that he dies.
He said he was feeling a little worse in the middle of the night. I was hoping that was the part where you get your worst part of your flu or whatever and start to go the other way.
He told us that he was shocked that Neil had died that night, which I found puzzling. He wanted us to believe that he had no idea this was coming. However, he had called everyone in the church there. They had done their faith healing things to try and make him better. They had anointed him with oil. They had laid on hands repeatedly, hourly, leading up to his death. So I believe that they knew very well that he was ill, that he was suffering and in grave danger.
Well, he wasn't feeling good that day, and I was there, but he didn't seem horrible or anything. I certainly didn't foresee him dying.
Did that come as a shock to you?
Because we took Marcy and we said, Marcy, why don't you go in and lay down, and because Neil's going to rest. And
What they did not do is call a doctor. They did not call 911.
What happened?
I went in to lay down. And when I got up and I went back in there, he had stopped breathing.
Marcy Beagley had told us that she wanted to take Neil to a doctor, and that had offered to take Neil to a doctor, and that Neil had said he did not want to go to a doctor.
You were very concerned.
Of course I was very concerned.
And why didn't you take him to the doctor?
He said he didn't need to go and he didn't want to go. We talked to him.
And was that his choice or was that your choice?
Well, I think it was a combination of a lot of things.
You talked about, well, I've been in this situation. Gosh, you were in that same situation 3 months before, weren't you?
No, it wasn't.
You were in a situation in which there was a relative who was ill, in which people were laying on hands and praying, and she stopped breathing, and she died.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
The Beagleys, being grandparents, were completely aware of what their granddaughter had gone through. And so consequently, there was this heightened awareness of when a child is in need of medical treatment. It makes the failure to respond, in some respects, almost seem worse.
Let me go back to the question, though, about whether or not, having been at the death of one of your own relatives, in which nobody apparently was willing to call a doctor, and they relied on faith healing, and the result was one of your children, your grandchild, died. And I'm asking you how that impacted your awareness of your responsibility to take care of your other kids.
I have awareness on what I'm supposed to take care of my kids all the time. And every situation's a different situation.
Well, the result was the same, though, wasn't it, Mr. Beagley?
I guess so. I didn't know it was going to be. I had no idea it was going to be.
Even though you'd been at the death of your granddaughter, in which people relied on faith healing without medical care, just 3.5 months beforehand. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right.
And my understanding is that the jury has, in fact, reached verdicts with regard to both of these cases. Is that also correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
The The Clackamas County prosecutors, still reeling from their failure to convict Ava Worthington's parents in her death, are now hoping that history won't repeat itself in the case against Neil Beagley's parents. That's why they told the jury how Ava died, hoping that it would help convict Jeff and Marcy Beagley for their son Neil's death. But in order to come up with a fair verdict, the jury has to sort through some pretty complex medical testimony, as well as firsthand accounts from investigators and family members.
Okay, Mr. Mackinson, you may proceed with closing argument on behalf of Mr. Jeff Beagley.
Thank you, Your Honor. These parents here, Jeff and Marcy Beagley, in this community were made out to be monsters. Monsters. I mean, if your kid is in excruciating pain and dying, you would take your kid to the doctor. And that's how they were portrayed. The story was that Neil lay there in excruciating pain and that his parents, instead of taking him to the doctor, instead prayed over him. And if you notice, the prosecutors, a number of questions through this trial, watched him die. Watched him die. And that's how these two parents were portrayed. They were portrayed as religious fanatics who martyred their son in the name of religion.
This isn't a faith-healing trial. It's never been a faith-healing trial. And that's why it's been suggested how outrageous their conduct was. We're not even asking you to decide whether a 16-year-old young man can refuse medical treatment. That's never been a component of our case. We already know about voting and drinking and birth control and pregnancy decisions and the abilities of 16-year-olds to assess risks. This table didn't argue any of those issues. All Marcy and Jeff did was the job that anyone could expect of reasonable parents. On the verdict form, the correct decision is that Marcy and Jeff are simply not guilty of criminally negligent homicide.
If I was in their situation and I had never left, I would have done the same thing. Like, it would never have occurred to me to call 911. It never would have occurred to me to take my kid to the doctor. We believed that kids who died like this were going to heaven. So I don't judge them. I don't blame them. It could have been me.
We actually walked the cemetery during our investigation, and there are so many, unmarked graves, so many baby boy this or baby girl this. It's really sad, and you wonder how many children have died that we just don't even know about.
In Clackamas County, what is reasonable for the way we take care of our children? Because what they did is outrageous. For them to be at their granddaughter's home and be there and watch her die, and then 3 months later, not carry that searing experience with them when they're evaluating their own child? Where is the common sense in that? Where is the community values about our kids, about how we take care of our kids? Because not guilty means, okay, it's time that it stops. There's not a separate rule for kids of the followers. There's not a separate rule that, okay, well, we'll allow them not to get medical care when there's not a single other kid in Clackamas County that wouldn't have medical care. Not one. No other parents would have put up with this. If Neil Beagley had been in a different family, he'd be alive today. And I'm going to end where I started, and that is to ask you to exercise the kind of judgment that reflects the value about the health and well-being of our children, and that you put a stop to this, that you tell the Beagleys that is not acceptable behavior. It's not just bad judgment. It's not just a mistake. It's just not an unfortunate turn of events. It's criminal. And you're the only ones that can do it. I'm asking that you return a verdict of guilty for both Mr. and Mrs. Beagley. Thank you very much.
The first vote was 10-2, guilty. You had people, two of the people thinking that the freedom of religion, and it's like, you have a freedom of religion, don't you think? But you have to make sure you hear everybody, because some people disagree with me, may have a good point, and you got to listen to it.
And my understanding is that the jury has, in fact, reached verdicts with regard to both of these cases. Is that also correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
In the matter of State of Oregon plaintiff versus Jeffrey Dean Beagley, defendant, the verdict form reads, "We, the jury, being duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled court and cause, hereby find the defendant guilty of the charge of criminally negligent homicide as alleged in the indictment." In the case of State of Oregon plaintiff versus Marcy Ray Beagley, defendant, the verdict form reads as follows: "We, the jury, being duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled court and cause, do hereby find the defendant guilty of the charge of criminally negligent homicide as alleged in the indictment."
There was no celebration. You don't celebrate when a kid's died for whatever reason. But there was a sense of relief that maybe this could have some impact on the future.
Faith is blind faith for a lot of people. Whether you're Catholic or whether you're part of this church, that you believe in miracles, and you believe that people can be healed through faith healing, anointing of oil, laying of hands, and they've seen it work. They've seen it work.
How are the Beagleys reacting to the verdict?
Very sad, as you can imagine. If a conviction and a prison sentence meant they got their son back, they'd do that in a heartbeat.
I do think that there should be laws, and I think that the kids should have basic medical care and life-saving medical care until they're old enough to decide for themselves. But ask me 20 years ago, and I would have disagreed.
There is a dividing line between religious freedom and the responsibility and rights of parents. And that got a clearer definition by these convictions. And the followers of Christ, I believe, absorbed that and perhaps have changed some of their practices.
Dozens of children have died as members of that church. Do you think this verdict will send a message to the other church members?
Well, I haven't seen any evidence to that effect. It seemed to be sort of anecdotal information in the community, so I can't speak to that.
I think the message has gotten out, but I also know that they are a very secret society. It's not always a feeling of like, hey, we've made a difference because we're not getting phone calls. It's more of, why aren't we getting phone calls? You know, what's going on that we're not hearing about?
Although Jeff and Marcy Beagley were convicted and sentenced to 16 months in prison, their punishment didn't stop child deaths in the followers of Christ Church. In 2009, Oregon passed a law limiting the protections for parents who reject life-saving medical care based on their faith. But it would take several more convictions with increasingly stiffer sentences before church members began to get the message. I'm Ashley Banfield. Thanks for watching.